We make it happen.
Right.
Is what we printed on the mugs. And in no time at all, someone put an SH in front of the "We make it happen."
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Womar, an author and journalist who has specialised in transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we aim to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews across the world of transport. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker. So, Mark, what have we got on today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. We have a packed programme today, and in a little while, we'll have an interview that you have recorded with Tim Shoveler, who's the boss of the rail freight business Freightliner. And Tim will be talking to us about his view of the rail industry in the UK and telling us some really interesting insights into his railway career. We also have a site visit. You've been out on a visit to Britain's newest transport system, the Luton Airport DART, which connects the railway station to the airport, self-evidently. And
nobody quite knows what it is. It's not a train. It seems to be a cableway, but it runs on the ground on pneumatic tires. So it's a rather interesting phenomenon.
It's an innovative form of transport technology that we'll be looking into a little bit later in the podcast. But first, we have some breaking news, because on the Tuesday of this week, the 7th of November, Parliament received the King's Speech, which is the formal address whereby His Majesty the King lays out the legislative programme of the United Kingdom government. It is, of course, as most people know, a speech actually written by the Prime Minister, but it's read out by the King as head of state. And of course, you and I and other transport aficionados were looking out for measures relating to our field and our sector. And of course, there was a big headline there, wasn't there, Christian?
Yes, I mean, they've made a lot of play about this, which is the autonomous vehicles bill. And it's likely to be a hefty piece of legislation. And they feel that the necessity for it, which is probably quite correct, is that there's no legislation at the moment that would actually determine who is responsible for an autonomous vehicle. In other words, if it had an accident, who would be responsible? How would you insure these things? How will you register them? And when will you decide what is a driverless car? So this legislation, which is, as I say, likely to be quite detailed, will try to set out these parameters. And now one interesting thing that they've signaled, which is that if a car is deemed driverless, and that's a difficult definition, and they're going to struggle with that, but we'll have to see in the legislation. If a car is deemed driverless or in a driverless mode, then the manufacturer will be responsible for any incidents and accidents. Now, of course, you're going to get cars that are driverless some of the time and not driverless other times. So I can see something of a legal minefield here, but it's very interesting that they put very much the onus on the manufacturers and the developers of the software to take responsibility for safety. And now the industry seems to have welcomed this to some extent, but I am kind of slightly skeptical, because I think that it's going to put a lot of onus on them to make these things extremely safe. And of course, in the last podcast, we talked about the accident in California to the cruise car, which then led to the withdrawal of all cruise cars around the whole country, which Cruise being one of the top two kind of autonomous vehicle operators. So there's an awful lot of complexity. But another issue, Mark, is that they found time to legislate for this because Rishi Sunak likes this sort of stuff. He's just had a AI conference at Bletchley Park, and he's had an interview with Elon Musk, which
he's
was
our tech bro prime minister. He's our tech bro prime minister, I think.
Absolutely, get bro prime minister, and it was a fawning interview. He was, he was almost in ecstasy in front of this great Elon Musk, who is a very flawed man, as we know. And yet they didn't find time for e-scooters, which actually is a much more pressing issue, because there's lots of e-scooters around, and these electric scooters have no legislation governing. Nobody knows whether you're supposed to ride them on the pavement or not. They're technically, they're actually illegal.
Indeed.
And they haven't been sorted out. But so it's amazing that they've got that sort of priority, which again, I think reflects the whole government thing, that they don't really care about what's going on day to day out there, but they care about this future industry, which they say, and I've seen these figures before, they say, by 2035, it will be employing 38,000 people and worth, £4.5 billion in revenue and all this, and which is complete nonsense figures just plucked out of the air. Meanwhile, people are getting knocked over by e-scooters whizzing about, or indeed, they're not able to get access to e-scooters, which are a perfectly reasonable form of transport, but need legislation.
Now, of course, I listened to the King's speech very carefully, but perhaps it's something about me that I don't always accept these things at face value. And as soon as the King had finished his address, I went off and sought out the explanatory note published by the government, which accompanies the speech, which runs to, I think it was over 70 pages. But buried within the explanatory note was another piece of legislation, or rather draft legislation, that hadn't been mentioned in the speech at all. And this was the Draft Rail Reform Bill. Now, the Draft Rail Reform Bill seeks to move forward the process of rail reform begun in May 2021, 2.5 years ago, with the publication of the William Shapps Plan for Rail and the proposals to set up Great British Railways as the single guiding mind for the Great Britain rail industry at arm's length from the government. But to everybody's astonishment, 2.5 years on, nothing has happened until now in relation to legislating for the changes that are required to bring that organisation into being. But now, Christian, we have a draft bill.
What's the difference between a white paper and a draft bill? I didn't really understand this.
Okay, well, the process of draft bills was introduced earlier in this century. It's quite a modern innovation. And the idea is that if the parliamentary calendar is overloaded, what you can do is bring forward a bill that you intend to put through the full parliamentary process of multiple readings and debates, perhaps in the next session. But in the meantime, you'll speed up the process by looking for flaws and errors and oversights that might need to be included in that legislation later on. So you publish a draft bill, and normally what will happen is it will be scrutinised by the relevant departmental select committee of the House of Commons. So in this case, it would be the Transport Select Committee, which is chaired by Ian Stewart MP. There have been occasions where the scrutiny has been done by a joint committee of both houses, from the Commons and the Lords. And the committee will have a look at the bill, the draft bill, in detail. They'll also accept representations and evidence, a bit like they would for any other select committee inquiry, from interested parties, stakeholders, industry organisations, consumer groups. And at the end, they'll publish a report that goes back to the government that says, we've had a look at your draft bill. We see what it is you're trying to achieve here, and here are the ways in which we think you need to improve and amend this bill before it comes back to Parliament for full consideration as an actual bill, leading to it becoming an act. Now, this
is a bit daft, since we know this is the last year.
This is exactly the point, Christian. This is exactly the point.
I mean,
so this is, of course,
going to be another government.
Unless something really unusual happens, this will be the last session of the current Parliament, And at some point towards the end of probably 2024 or early 2025, we'll have a new parliament, which may have a new government in place. It may be the Conservatives or returned, in which case you would expect them to pick up all the lessons from the draft bill and then seek to introduce a new bill to Parliament. But of course, it might be a government of a different political complexion, so who may well choose to junk all of this work essentially and start again. So the curious thing about it is here is what was 2.5 years ago, a flagship government policy, the William Shapps Plan for Rail, establishment of Great British Railways. 2.5 years on, for whatever reasons, and perhaps we might discuss this another time, they don't seem to have the confidence to enact their own proposals.
Well, that leaves basically the rail industry in limbo for at least another year, doesn't it? Because they're back down to discussing something that, as you say, well, actually, Mark, you've been rather generous. This process started in 2018, when there was the timetable chaos, and then the setting up of the Williams inquiry, and then this chap Grant Shapps joined in and produced that paper, which then largely got junked because basically it was a Johnson era paper, and so they didn't like what was in it, and then started the process of Great British Railways. And now, 5 years on from that, we're basically nowhere further forward.
And I think in a way that leads quite neatly into our interview, or rather the interview you recorded with Tim Shoveler, the boss of Freightliner, somebody with as we'll hear, with a distinguished railway career and quite a lot to say about the current conditions of the rail industry in Great Britain and its future prospects. So here we go.
With all the recent crisis on the railways, I thought I'd catch up with Tim Shoveler, who is now the chief executive of Freightliner in UK and Europe. He's been a railwayman for the past over 30 years in all sorts of jobs, both with Network Rail and with train operators. But now he's decided to go and join a freight company. And I thought it would be really interesting to hear what he thinks of the present state of the industry today. So, Tim, just give me a little brief background about your experience.
Okay, yeah. Well, absolutely, railway through and through. My first railway experience actually was as a volunteer on a steam railway when I was still at school. And I was really fortunate to have some good sponsorship from guys that used to run British Rail's training and education thing. So I was always going to join the railway. And I was intending to go to university and then join BR as a graduate. I'd done lots of work experience with BR when I was as young as 15. I remember walking alongside the tracks from Richmond to Twickenham, which you definitely wouldn't do today.
You can't, yes.
And then I went to university for a couple of days, and I thought, you know what, I've had enough now with academia. I thought I really want to get on and run the railway. I just love being in Orange. I just love running trains. So I rang up my contact at British Rail and said, I'm not going to complete my degree. I've only been here, and he said, well, if you don't have a degree, you can only join at the bottom.
Right.
So, what about train crews? I was like, yeah, great. So I joined British Rail as what was called a trainman D, which is a trainee driver / guard at Guildford Depot in early 1990s something, and I had that was my first professional job on the railway. Yeah.
And so this doesn't happen, of course, today. I don't think you could work your way up in that way.
I hope you could actually. I mean, in some respects, I think the railway is something of a meritocracy, and there is a huge deficiency in training and education and support. I think that I'll come back to when we talk about Great British Railways. But I do think that there aren't the glass ceilings, because I haven't got a degree. I'm not the most educated person in the world, but I am enormously enthusiastic about railways. And I'd like to think I've learned a bit about how to operate them, and indeed how to work with people over over that time.
Okay, so briefly, you've been with train operators, you've been with Network Rail.
Yeah, someone called me railway tar because I moved around so much, but I did my own management training scheme, you see, in the end.
Right.
So I had a great time with British Rail. I was at Eurostar in 1993 when we were opening Waterloo. Ashford International as project manager to open the station there when Eurostars used to stop in Ashford. And then when I really capped up in Eurostar, I went to Silverlink, as it was then, as driver.
That was a terrible. Service.
It was the only E-graded railway in the country.
It was terrible. It was half an hour service on the North London line. Well, very old trains.
Funny enough, when I was there, we increased it from half hourly to 3 trains an hour.
Good for you, right?
Three trains now, Richmond to Stratford. We make it happen. Right. Is what we printed on the mugs. And in no time at all, someone put an SH in front of the "We make it happen." That was Silverlink. Right. But drive manager, great experience there. And then lots of other train companies from there. Wessex Trains down in the West Country. That was my first operations director's role. Midland Main Line, and moved to Kettering really for Midland Main Line, and then from that really launched me into. That was big management, and then I started working with Virgin as operations director, doing all the preparing for the introduction of the new Pendolinos and the tilting timetable. Met Stagecoach through that, met Brian Souter through that, and then when East Midlands was won by Stagecoach in 2007, they asked me if I'd be the managing director. Right,
and you've also then, of course, gone to had a spell at Network Rail, and there's not many people who've done that these days. Andrew Haynes, actually, the boss of Network Rail, is one of the rare people who's been on both sides. But you then joined Network Rail, and that presumably gave you really the all-round experience of the railway.
I had 2 goes with Network Rail in effect, because we did the South West Trains Network Rail Alliance back in 2012 when I was both the MD of South West Trains and the route director for Network Rail, running the Wessex route. That was amazing experience, and I lost a lot of hair as a result of that.
You've lost some more since.
I have very genuinely came the closest I've ever come to having a breakdown at work.
Really?
The pressure was.
What was the pressure?
Well, a lot of it was pressure I put on myself, because I was so determined to demonstrate how a train company and an infrastructure company working together was better. And there is not a shred of doubt in my mind that it was better, and we could just see it in our people.
But I remember writing about it. It did have problems, didn't it?
Well, the alliance itself, the delivery didn't have problems. What had problems was you had an owner in Network Rail and an owner in Stagecoach. Each had completely different objectives. I couldn't have asked for more support from Robin Gisby in Network Rail, or from Martin Griffiths in Stagecoach. But fundamentally, what the alliance couldn't resolve is that the shareholders had completely different objectives that were set by different organisations.
This is very interesting. This is very relevant to today's railway.
Relevant.
Okay,
yeah,
so what were the different objectives then?
Well, of course, the Stagecoach was delivering the objectives of the DfT through the franchise agreement, and Network Rail was trying to deliver the objectives of the ORR, arguably government, through the regulated track access agreements.
Right, and what's the difference there? So
fundamentally, because of course different measures of management, different measures are being used. South West Trains was trying to drive revenue, but of course from Network Rail perspective, it was about getting costs down, for example.
Right.
Now they don't have
they're
to
both
be,
good. They're both good aims.
They're both good aims. They don't have to be incompatible, but trying to deliver that on an industry that was still fundamentally geared at being combative as opposed to collaborative was the challenge.
Right.
And we made a lot of progress. There was a lot of things that we did, which I'm still very this day proud of. Reopening Waterloo International. You have to remember, when we started the alliance, Waterloo International was a theatre, and it was being used to stage
the railway children. Yes.
And I remember doing something with a journalist, trying to explain how Waterloo was the busiest station in the country by far, and some trains, poor performance was nowhere near where it should be. Some trains were turning around in 7 minutes, having arrived from Portsmouth, 1,200 people off, every number of hundreds of people on, trying to do that in 7 minutes because the platform utilisation was so tight, and of course it didn't work. And this journalist said to me, "You've got a spare station next door, couldn't you use that?" And I'm like, well, obviously we could.
But actually, this is like bugbear of the me. It took, I think, 10 years to get those four.
It took the alliance. It would not have happened because again.
And what were the problems then? Why can't you? You've got five empty platforms that were empty for 10 years because of what?
Well, because it was I think a lack of determination from the industry to open them.
Right.
I mean, they were configured for the Eurostar operation, which of course I've been part of in 1993, so I knew them very well, which is why I had a real association with trying to get them reopened again. So
the junctions were in the wrong place.
Exactly. Well, essentially, it was set out for trains that were a quarter of a mile long, that ran infrequently.
Right.
And of course, what you needed then was to turn it into a railway that was suitable for suburban trains that were much shorter but ran at much higher frequencies.
But that's not rocket science.
It wasn't rocket science. It was actually done quite quickly, and it was relatively cheap.
Right.
It wasn't in the CP5 enhancement plan, and yet it was delivered in CP5. So I think it was a really good example of the train operator wanting something, the infrastructure manager wanting to deliver it, and to be fair, on this occasion the DfT came to the party.
Right.
And between DfT, Network Rail and South West Trains, so a scheme went from...
But it had sat unused for that long because... Well, there was nobody driving. There was no champion.
And it wasn't in South West Trains' interest to reopen it. It was a risk to South West Trains. It created financial risk and uncertainty. There was a 10-car extension program, which was again only partly funded. So everyone was trying to. This is one of the things that Andrew Haynes does a brilliant job of trying to illustrate, that everyone's trying to do the right thing. South West Trains was trying to do the right thing. The DfT were trying to do the right thing. Network Rail were trying to do the right thing, but everyone had slightly different objectives, and those objectives are mismatched. And when you do that, of course, it takes a very long time to achieve something which is actually quite simple. That's the root cause of the problem we've got with our railway.
Okay, today. We'll come back to that, because I mean that's going to be the theme that I want to end up on. But just so to take us just a little bit through your career, you went to Network Rail, and then you went elsewhere, and then you went back to Network Rail.
That's right.
And it is fair to say, Tim, that you were one of the people that people expect might be the next boss of Network Rail, but now you've gone to Freightliners. I mean, is that is that kind of because you were disillusioned with the existing railway, or what was the reason for that move?
Yeah, I mean, a number of things really. I loved working for Andrew and Lord Peter. I mean, I learned a lot from both of them. So
Lord Peter, yes.
Lord Peter, yeah, absolutely, well deserved actually.
Lord Peter Hendy, you're referring to.
Lord Peter Hendy, sorry, yeah, thank you. That's right. So I loved working for them both, and I learned a lot from both of them. Right. And I enjoyed working with some really great colleagues at Network Rail. So this isn't about Network Rail. For me, I had come to a point, I think, where I'd seen the extent of government involvement in running the railway through the negotiations that we were doing with the RMT and to resolve the rail strikes. I'd seen just how difficult it was for even colleagues in the DfT to get things done that they wanted to do, and a real period of stagnation within the industry, because despite there being some really obvious urgent things that needed to be done, which Andrew was trying to drive through GBR, the ability to implement those was effectively zero. And
what was your role?
So I was regional managing director for North West and Central, which was basically the old Midland region. So Euston, Marylebone to Birmingham, Scotland, with Manchester and Liverpool. And it was an amazing job because about 9,000 employees, and it was everything from today's operation all the way through to HS2 integration, rebuilding East West Rail, the strategy for CP7. Brilliant. Right. And then, of course, I was asked to work with the Network Rail HR team to prepare for and try and avoid, and then manage our way through the industrial relations and disputes that came, really as a result of the outflow of COVID, pay, but the need to reduce costs of running the railway, modernise Network Rail's maintenance organisation. So I spent almost a year doing that, and that was when I had this huge visibility of what was necessary from a Network Rail perspective, and indeed nowadays from a train company perspective, through the DfT, into Treasury, into government, to make anything happen. And look, yeah, it's entirely understandable that with the government providing such huge additional funds to the industry
post-COVID,
that government obviously needs its taxpayers' money and expects and needs transparency and visibility of that. Of course, couldn't be any other way.
But I can see a but coming in.
A huge but, insofar as the fact, of course, it slows everything down. And I've Charles Belcher, when he was managing director of Silverlink, going back to Silverlink, and of Wessex Trains and of Virgin Trains, one of the things that I really learnt from Charles was that to make things work properly, you need to invest power in your frontline teams, because they know how the railway runs. And I'd have felt that when I was running the railway myself. They know how to make it better. They know where it's going wrong. So the local management team, the frontline teams, they need to be engaged, and they've got to be able to get on and be challenged to run their business. And of course, what we've seen was that power, any authority being removed, because ultimately, of course, levels of governance became much higher,
So what, they couldn't make local decisions?
Yeah, exactly.
Have you got an example at all?
Goodness. So many ways to start. I think what I'd seen is that I'll give an example. When I was East Midlands Trains, we were contracted to run one train an hour to Sheffield, and we knew that we could run two, and there was a good argument for running two. And we really had to work hard, but we were able to work hard with the DfT to run that second train. And it still runs today, two trains an hour to Sheffield.
No, it would make money, basically.
That's right, exactly.
Right.
And
it would be profitable.
it does. Yeah. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So it was hard, but it was achievable, and it took a couple of months.
Right.
Well, where's that innovation gone now? What do we see happening around the network today? What have we seen in the last couple of years? If I take something simple like how many operators there are between Coventry and Birmingham, right? How many different fare structures there are between Coventry and Birmingham. And the irony is the train which has the fewest seats on it, which is the cross-country train, which is not the train that you'd want to have your volume on, is cheaper than the others. Right. It's only marginally cheaper.
Right, but there's lots of students do that journey.
Of course they do.
They all pile on at Coventry.
Right,
I've been there. Yes.
It doesn't help cross country.
Yes.
It doesn't help. So actually, one of the things I was really hoping to do is to be able to rationalise that, to say, look, the West Midlands train service provides big 8-car commuter trains between Coventry and Birmingham. So clearly, as an industry, we would direct people towards those trains.
Right.
Definitely not towards the 4 or 5 carriage cross country train.
Which are full of longer distance travellers anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. Because no ability to influence that change whatsoever, even though we tried. Even though we tried, and because of course that involves lots of different train operating companies, lots of different fares agreements, lots of Department for Transport. Bring all of that together, and we tried to bring all that together. It was impossible to create.
But surely that should be easier now that we no longer have revenue risk.
Of course, it should be easier. Well, of course, it should be easier.
Right.
But what it requires is leadership, and then the ability to implement and direct change.
And that can't come within the present structure.
Absolutely, I think that's what we've concluded, isn't it? We don't see any examples of it. But if we know that it's possible, and I think that's one of the reasons why the GBR structure, which we thought was going to be implemented for a while, was giving such reason for hope, because it would have allowed, GBR region, and hopefully in the future still will, to take something really simple like that. How do we present the trains to passengers at Coventry from a fares perspective, from an information perspective? When things are going wrong, how do we deal with it? Still today, you will hear if trains are delayed. I heard it just at rugby the other week. There was an announcement to say the West Midlands trains to Birmingham is not running. The next train is an Advantage train. You can't get on it unless you've got the right ticket. And I'm not. That's no criticism of the
right.
Because that's the way the railway is still structured, isn't it?
Right.
It's you've got different train companies who are effectively non-competing with each other, and at a time when our passenger volumes are down, when we need to be regrowing the passenger volumes back on the market, and we should do that by providing better information and cleaner and simpler fares.
So you felt that at Network Rail, you couldn't kick this horse, as it were.
That's right, and you could work collaboratively, but the ability to make any change like that was still a distant thing away. And I was, I'd worked through in my mind all these changes I'd like to make once the GBR came about, but you could see there were going to be some, I regret to say, probably some years away.
And who's saying no there? Who is the DfT saying no? Is the Treasury saying no? I mean, who is saying no, or is there just nobody to put forward these sort of plans?
I think there's a huge respect for the MDs of the train companies and Network Rail colleagues, because they want to work together. But the environment that we're part of, and this is what we saw during the Alliance, there is a desire for collaboration, but you've got to enable collaboration, and to enable it, you've got to have common objectives set, and there are not common objectives set for franchise for train companies and for Network Rail. They're still there are areas of overlap, but they're not aligned.
Right.
And they need to be aligned. And again, this is the key learning from the Alliance. You've got to have, in order to allow collaboration, you need to have aligned objectives.
So you did leave with some frustration.
Oh, look, so I was excited about what I was hoping I would be able to achieve.
Right.
It had GBR come about.
Right.
I could see that was going to be several years away. With King's speech coming and all, or not coming, all of those things. So I thought to myself, do you know what? I need to be excited. I need to motivate myself, and I was getting frustrated. So I thought, look, I can either stay here and continue to, as I perceive, battle and fight, which is what I saw colleagues doing, having to battle and fight the system in order to try and achieve change. That was one option, but that was depressing me, and it was causing me frustration. And I thought, I don't want to do that. I need to spend, the tail end of my career doing jobs that I really enjoy. And I'd been, my son had started working for GB Rail with John Smith's team about 6 months ago. 6 months before, I could see
his
how much
son works there as well.
He does. That's right. Yeah, I could see how much he was enjoying himself.
Right.
It reminded me of what I did when I joined the railway in terms of being out on the track and shunting trains. And then I heard about this vacancy at Freightliner, and I thought that's interesting. It's fair to say a year previous I probably wouldn't have been tempted.
Interesting.
As I started to learn about the job, I became thoroughly energised by it. Just going through the interview process was re-energising me.
Okay, I'm not really going to cover your Freightliner job at the moment because we're talking. But I think I'd love to come back and talk to you about that. But I want to hone down on. So what should happen now in the rest of the areas, and how do you see a solution to this? I mean, you saw GBR as a kind of positive thing. If it, maybe explain that. I mean, you're an integration. I've always been an integration. I've always said that the railways function best as a unit. This whole separation between track and infrastructure and operations is fake. There's no such business as a train path provider. There's no business of a train operator without having some control of the tracks.
I mean, that's a big debate, isn't it? I think I'm not quite that extreme. I'm more sort of horses for courses. I think there are some railways. Let's take a suburban commuter railway. South West Trains is a good example. That absolutely need to be like that.
Right.
Because there is really only one customer.
Yes.
Especially for much of the suburban area, and the integration needs to be as tight as a drum. And look, from a cost perspective, you want every person that's employed to be able to do whatever role is necessary. In BR days, the mobile operations manager, nowhere else would have that role, would used to come onto the platform at Guildford and help dispatch the morning peak trains because they were still part of the railway community.
Right.
Okay. Right. So and you wanted as many people dispatching the morning peak trains as possible. Get shut the doors as quickly as possible. Right. It didn't matter. It didn't have to be platform staff to shut. The station manager used to help dispatch the morning peak trains because nothing was more important.
Right.
Where's that focus today?
Yes. Right.
And of course, because you've got fragmentation, you end up either employing more people to dispatch the morning peak trains, or you don't dispatch them.
Right.
As well, because everyone with a different badge is doing a different job.
But you think some other railways the longer distance railways could?
I think absolutely. I think there are different types of railways. West Coast Main Line, East Coast Main Line are good examples where actually you've got a very different principle. The West Coast Main Line is a bit like a motorway. It is a bit like the M1. Yeah. There are, I think, 18 or 19 different companies that use it, including Freightliner in both its forms. So. Absolutely, in that regard, having just saying the intercity operator, because it's got the biggest revenue, for example, is in charge of the whole of the West Coast Main Line. I don't think that works. So, but again, in the centre of Birmingham, centre of Manchester, running out of Waterloo or Charing Cross, I think it's different. And one of the things which I always think we miss as a community is we bang on about best practice all the time. And I really don't like talking about best practice. I talk about good practice. Because what is good practice in Bedford is probably very different from what is good practice in Basingstoke. They've got completely different electrification systems. They've got different patterns of use. Do you see what I mean? And so it's too simplistic to take and say, well, that's that you can apply these things. They're both 50 miles north and south of London, by the way, Basingstoke. Yes. But actually, what works in each location will be different because of the needs of the traffic, because of the needs of the business that it's supporting, and yet we're relatively blind to that. Okay,
so to get back to it, so GBR needs to be horses for courses. So how do you see it as going, or how do you see we can have a new government? The GBR is not going to be in the King's Speech. We all know that. So set out what the agenda should be. So how are we going to repair this? How are we going to get these incentives aligned, and how are we going to repair the current crises?
Yeah. So in the first instance, until there is time for legislation in order to create it may not be called GBR with a different government. It doesn't matter. The principle of the guiding mind. A strong organisation that is able to provide and set direction for the industry. But
independent of the DFT.
Absolutely. For the DFT's own sake in that regard, and the ministers, because then they've got deniability as well, haven't they? As used to happen with BR. A real build on the SRA, actually stronger with the SRA.
The Strategic Rail Authority.
Thank you. Yeah. Because obviously with Network Rail being embedded in it, or the infrastructure management function being embedded in it, it creates a much more capable leading organisation. But then locally, through the regions and through the routes and through the train companies, I think that's where that devolution really needs to happen. You can see this being demanded from people like Andy Street and Andy Burnham. They don't want. There's no chance of a GBR located in Derby or London or wherever trying to direct what the right thing for Manchester is. But there is a great scope for GBR to be clear on some principles about how we should operate. Which was the work that now that Anit and now Rufus are very much engaged on.
At the GBR
transition team. Exactly, that's right. So creating the structure, creating the model that can then be locally applied. And as I say, I think that would be different in the centre of Manchester than it might be on the West Coast Main Line itself. Now, how you bring those together, now that's going to be the really tricky bit, isn't it? Because actually but it's necessary to find a way to do that.
I'm always slightly sceptical about this devolution thing because you need certain basic standards. You need ways to do things, and not quite sure how you integrate that with it. I'm more the idea of devolution I like, but in practice, how do you get over that issue?
But I think it's already very devolved. And go back to my example about Bedford and Basingstoke, actually they do it differently.
Right.
Because it needs to be done differently. So I think there's a lot more devolution in terms of local application of standards and policies than already is acknowledged. So I think we start from that perspective. I do think that the ability for people to align around objectives is what matters, because that will then pull colleagues to be able to innovate and to use different systems for delivery. Go back to something really simple like high output. The high output trains. Until we did the alliance, the high output train had never worked on the southern region.
This is the yellow trains that check out all
the southern region, because the perception was that was all about in city. It was about main line.
Right.
And the sleepers on the southern region are slightly wider because of the need for the third rail electrification.
Okay.
So they didn't fit through the machine.
Right.
So what we did is we amended the machine that cost about £250 million, as you remember, and then set it to work, and it did some amazing work for us. And it
checking the track
and renewing the track and renewing the sleepers, renewing the ballast. But it did it in a way that was entirely suitable for the operation because we built the two things together.
Right.
Yeah. But that's locally generated knowledge, isn't it? It was understanding that we could finish the train service between Basingstoke and Southampton at 8 o'clock in the evening on a Monday through Wednesday to allow the machine to be productive. Right. All of that intelligence is locally driven, but it needs to be set against some objectives that people are trying to achieve.
But you still see as quite difficult exactly how it works. Is that, how that integration works?
What I haven't seen yet, because I think, frankly, the process didn't complete, was how the regions of GBR would be, can and would be structured so that it provides the ability in Manchester and Birmingham to do the right things for those areas, while still recognising that there'll be 3 trains now from Euston driving into Manchester. That's the
as I understand it, the structure they put forward was that there would be a sort of overall person who'd both be the route director and the operator, and then below them there would be a person in charge of operations, a person in charge of the infrastructure, and they would work to this structure.
That's it. I was pretty familiar with that, and that, but that is I think it requires a lot more definition than that in order to make the examples of Birmingham, Manchester, West Coast Main Line work. But that's absolutely the right model.
Right.
And we're always in danger of doing this. I think that's one of the most complicated bits of the problem to solve. Actually, because as I said, it's a lot easier out of Waterloo. Right. It's a lot easier out of Charing Cross, isn't it? It's a lot easier on the Great Western.
Right.
So I think we shouldn't. Yes, that.
But you mean that other places where it's much more difficult?
Correct. That's right. So some places where it's complex, Manchester,
Birmingham,
and there are some places where it's much simpler.
Right.
So again, we don't have to hold everything up, do we? Let's move faster and furthest at the locations where we can see that it's obviously the right thing to do.
So to end up on, are you optimistic that we can get there?
Yeah, I am an optimistic person. Right. I think the railway's been through some pretty dark periods in its history, and we can all read about those. 1970s, but ultimately there's some great people that work for the industry. The need for the railway, this is so important. The need for the railway, I think, is greater than ever. The climate emergency moves the railway's ability to move lots of people in a carbon-friendly way, or lots of goods in a carbon-friendly way. It moves that from being a nice thing to have to a must-have. As a society, we need that, and we need to maximise its capacity and its potential. And we won't get that if we just have a whole series of random structures that are incapable of working efficiently with each other.
Well, that's a very good note to end on. Tim, I can't thank you enough. That was absolutely terrific. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Why I found that so interesting, Mark, was that here is somebody who is seen as a possible future boss of Network Rail. He's somebody who's worked in all sorts of different parts of the rail industry, enormously respected, enormously liked, and yet he's chosen to leave the passenger rail sector for now to go and run he actually runs a company that's actually bigger than Freightliner. It's all part of a larger company that encompasses a lot of American, what they used to call mom and pop railways, kind of short lines. But nevertheless, so he's gone to a big job, but he's left the passenger rail sector out of frustration, really. You can hear that frustration, that he just found it impossible to get things done. And as we mentioned earlier, it's because the railway industry is in this state of limbo. It's actually in a state of crisis. And it needs people like Tim Shoveler to help sort it out. So let's hope that when we do get a new government, they bring him back and other people like him are attracted into the industry to sort it out.
Christian has been out on a visit to Britain's newest public transport system, the DART, linking Luton Airport with the local railway station. So here's his report.
I'm at Luton Airport Parkway Station, visiting Britain's newest transport link. And with me is the General Manager of Luton's DART, Linsey, who will explain to us exactly the short history of this. So tell me, Linsey, when did it open and what's it for?
Okay, so we opened and went into operation on the 27th of March of this year, so just over 6 months now, and we connect Luton Airport Parkway and the main line rail network to Luton Airport's terminal. And the DART has replaced the diesel bendy buses that used to operate on the road network. So we've improved the passenger experience and we've cut the journey time significantly.
Right, and it runs for a couple of kilometres. And what is it? Is it a railway?
No, it's not a railway. It's in its simplest form is a cable car. So the technology is the same as your standard ski lift, the cable car over the Thames. It's all the same. Our cable is underneath rather than on the top, but it's pulled up and down the hill by a cable.
Yes, it doesn't go up in the air, so it doesn't seem like much of a cableway to me, because it's pulled along on pneumatic tyres,
yes,
isn't it?
That's right. Yes.
By a cable.
Yes.
And why was that method chosen? It's because there's a hill up there?
Yeah, so the difference between the top and bottom is around 40 metres in height. So a standard train couldn't obviously do that. And so cable was deemed as the most efficient and best way to get people up and down the hill.
And it cost some £300 million. Who exactly paid for that, and how does it work?
So Luton DART is owned by a company called Luton Rising, and we are sole shareholder to Luton Borough Council, and the entire project was funded by Luton Rising and Luton Council.
And has it been successful in the first few months of operation?
Yeah, we kicked off, as I said, in March. We celebrated our millionth passenger in August, and we're looking to have our 2 millionth before Christmas.
Right, and it's not necessarily cheap, is it? Because for a 2 kilometre ride, what does it cost?
So the standard fare is £4.90. You can buy that as part of your rail ticket. So an advance purchased on an EMR fast train can be less than £10. So it can still represent good value.
Right, and there's some problem over the concessions, isn't there? Because I've got an old person's card, but it doesn't quite work straight away.
No, so we were really conscious that the buses were free to bus pass holders, and going from free to a fare would be a significant increase. So we created what we've called a concessions account. So people who have got bus passes can travel for free. They just need to plan it in advance, but no different to they'd plan their train fare or their airfare. So it's all just part of that journey booking procedure.
So if you want it on your concession, Freedom Pass or whatever, you have to book it in advance.
Yeah, you have to have an account and just order your ticket in advance.
Right.
But you can order it on the morning. It's instantly delivered to your phone.
Right, okay. And so it cost £300 million to build.
Yes.
Was that within budget, or did it go a bit over, or what?
It was over the original budget. The respecs budget after COVID and everything else was, it's still within that. We have built 2 stations, we've built a elevated track, we've built a tunnel. So it's a significant infrastructure that we've built rather than just a cableway up and down the hill.
Right, and Luton, just to go slightly off subject, you had a little problem with a car park recently.
Yes, so on the 10th of October, obviously there was a significant fire at one of the terminal car parks at the airport, and that impacted our operation for 12 days. But we're all back to normal now and working with our partners to make sure everything's safe.
And the DART had to not run for 12 days as a result of that.
That's right.
Yes.
We're right next to the car park that was on fire. So until that was deemed safe, the airport didn't permit us to operate.
And we've just gone and visited the car park, and some of the cars are still in there, aren't they?
Yeah.
And this is kind of 4 or 5 weeks afterwards.
So the airport are obviously putting out lots of information, but most of the cars are unsalvageable, we've been told, yeah.
And you've got some plans to expand both the airport and possibly DART?
Yeah, so Luton Rising has got a development consent order in planning with government now, and that's going through consideration and all the various rounds of approvals, and that will look to take the airport from the current 19 million up to 32 million by 2032, and that will be across 2 terminals as well.
And they'll be connected with DART?
DART will be a significant part of that project, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much,
You're
Linsey.
welcome.
That's a great rundown for Britain's latest transport link.
Thank you.
And I think it's more a railway than a cable car, but we'll leave that one
We can
alone.
argue that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Here's Christian's final thought from the departure lounge.
Well, there's some light at the end of the tunnel, possibly, about one of the major disputes in the rail industry between RMT and the train operators, which has gone on for about 18 months. And in earlier editions of this podcast, Mark and I set forward what we thought would be the solution, which was to separate out the pay deal and to basically grant the pay deal to the workers. And that's well below inflation, but they were always prepared to accept that, with the conditions that the operators were trying to impose of different working practices, of possible redundancies, of all sorts of kind of changes to the way of working, which were seen as contingent on the pay deal. In other words, they would only accept the pay deal. They would only kind of offer the pay deal if the extra conditions were met by the workers, and that was always unacceptable. We always said separate out the two, and now it seems that precisely has happened, and they are now moving towards from what one hears from the General Secretary RMT, Mick Lynch, accepting the pay deal, and they'll go on to negotiate the other things. Something that could have been done 18 months ago, and an awful lot of disputes and stoppages would not have been necessary. However, ASLEF remains in dispute. The train drivers' union remains in dispute, and we have to watch that space to hope that too could get resolved, so we can get back to building up the railways and building people's confidence in the fact that they're not going to be affected by these strikes. So watch this space.
Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.